Okay, the next item of business is a debate on motion 20561 in the name of Anna Sarwar on the role of political decision-making in NHS scandals. I would invite members wishing to participate to press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Anna Sarwar to speak to and move the motion up to 13 minutes. Mr Sarwar.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Over a decade ago, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital opened before it was ready. It opened with contaminated water. That contamination infected patients and led to the deaths of at least 2 children. Weeks before the Children's Hospital opened, an internal report warned of a high risk of infection and therefore a high risk to life for immunocompromised patients. That warning was ignored. Children were forced to fight not only cancer, but an unseen danger within the very walls meant to protect them. I believe this is at least negligence, but more likely criminal incompetence. Pressure was applied and the hospital opened anyway with devastating consequences. Now I want to put on record that I recognise the extraordinary work that happens at this hospital every single day and that many NHS staff go above and beyond. But that must be true for every patient and every family, and one failure is one too many. But this is not simply one failure. This is without question the biggest scandal in the history of this Scottish Parliament. I will.
Let's call Hamilton.
I'm very grateful for Mr Sarwar for giving way. He's absolutely right to pay tribute to the hard-working staff at the QEUH. Does he recognise also that a number of staff have been affected by compromised water supplies and that staff sickness is a factor of this as well?
Anna Sarwar.
Absolutely, I do recognise that. And I actually want to start by focusing on the staff, because I want to recognise the people often only described as the whistleblowers. They are in fact 3 inspiring and courageous women who risked their careers and reputations to speak up and who were met with bullying and attempts to silence them. So let me put on record for the first time in this Parliament my gratitude to Dr Penelope Redding, Dr Teresa Inkster and Dr Christine Peters. And let me say clearly and directly to them, thank you. You are owed an apology. You are owed an apology, but actually you're owed more than that. Not only do colleagues and families owe them a debt of gratitude, I believe this nation does too. For nearly 10 years, these women have been bullied and dismissed by the very organisation that they were proud to serve. Had they been listened to, we would not be in the situation we are today. And even now, no chief executive and no chair has met them. And the only minister that has met them was Jean Freeman. And crucially, the information they need to be assured the real change has taken place is still not being shared with them. So in terms of their immediate concerns on the safety of this hospital, I say clearly, if they are not satisfied, I am not satisfied, and nobody in this Parliament and across the country should be satisfied either. And everything that they've warned about in the last 10 years has proven to be true, and everything that ministers and officials said to refute it has proven to be untrue. Yet today, we are again being asked to believe the same people that have lied to us for years and ignored those that have fought for the truth. Now, there are 2 urgent issues being raised by these doctors. First, we still do not have confirmation that the hospital has been fully validated, meaning a deep and comprehensive check of every ward and unit to ensure it meets the standards patients and families have every right to expect. So a direct question to the Health Secretary. Has the hospital been fully validated? Every ward, every unit, yes or no? If these doctors still do not know whether that hospital validation has taken place, it raises serious questions. So has any validation had independent verification? And why has that report not been shared with these doctors if it exists? So again, I ask, has the validation been completed, yes or no? And if it has, will they publish the full validation of every ward and every unit across the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital? Surely the Health Secretary knows the answer. Wow! That is utterly shameful and an abdication of the responsibility of this government and this Health Secretary. And specifically on ventilation, which is a risk to adults, not just children, there has been a separate report on the safety of the system, the so-called ACOM report. Has the government seen this report? Will they publish this report? And will they allow that too to have independent verification? Still no answer from the Health Secretary. Utterly shameful, I have to say, Presiding Officer, that a government is refusing to say to people across the country whether this hospital and every ward and every unit has been validated and therefore is safe. No response. Now, last week, John Swinney said that the government first became aware of issues at the hospital in March 2018. That is simply not true. Under infection control procedures, when a high red warning is issued, the Health Minister must be informed. A red warning was issued in June 2017. Was the Health Secretary informed in June 2017? Yes or no? No answer. Has Neil Gray, as Health Secretary, been notified of any higher red warnings since he has been Health Secretary? If so, when and how many? No answer from the Health Secretary. Yet another abdication of responsibility from a Health Secretary that is paid by this public to keep them safe and run our National Health Service. But back to the opening of the hospital. A process does exist, Presiding Officer. Jean Freeman saw a report on the Edinburgh Sick Kids Hospital and refused to allow it to open because she did not believe it was safe. Why did Nicola Sturgeon, John Swinney and Shona Robinson not do the same for the hospital in Glasgow? And we now know that an internal report issued just weeks before the Children's Hospital opened warned of a high risk of infection and therefore a high risk to life for immunocompromised patients, but that report was ignored and the hospital opened regardless. Who made the decision to ignore it? On what basis was the risk to life deemed acceptable? And who applied political pressure to get the hospital opened? Again, I invite the Health Secretary to give a response, and yet again he demonstrates he's useless in office and sits there looking blankly. Last week, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde said pressure was applied to open the hospital before it was ready. 5 days later, they retracted that statement late on Saturday night, knowing the First Minister was on television the next morning. So it does leave me intrigued. Who applied the pressure for that statement to be issued, and was it the same people that applied the pressure to open the hospital too early? We must know whether those applying pressure and the ministers to whom the board was accountable had any indication of patient safety concerns. I won't, because if anyone should intervene and answer these direct questions, it is the Health Secretary whose job it is to know the answer to these questions. That is why, alongside the demand to release the files, I am making a further demand today.
Can you resume your seat, Mr Sarwar? Point of order, Christine Graham.
I hesitate, but I have concerns that we have an inquiry yet to report. And yet what I'm listening to some extent, is rerunning the evidence and suggesting other evidence. And the whole point of the inquiry is to be wholly independent of any political nuances, suggestions or whatever. And I'm asking, Deputy Presiding Officer, for guidance in whether, as Chair, you consider that this is now stepping into an area it should not step into.
Thank you for your point of order, Ms Graham. Were I to believe that it did step into an area it shouldn't be stepping into, I would be stepping in myself. I do not consider that's the case. Anna Sarwar, please continue.
Presiding Officer, I have been raising these issues for 7 years, and for 7 years I've heard the same nonsense that Christine Graham has just recounted there. And let me just say to SNP members, these infections in these hospitals, they don't discriminate by political affiliation. These infections don't discriminate by people's constitutional position. This infection contaminates you whether you're yes or no, or an SNP voter, or a Labour voter, or a voter of no party at all. So you should care about these issues as much as people on these benches do. But we must know the truth behind the political decision-making, because this inquiry is vital and it must, yes, run its course, but new information has come to light in the last week and no real scrutiny has taken place in the political decisions that were made before and after the hospital was opened. You do yourself a disservice, Ms Graham, I must say, in your response. Nicola Sturgeon, John Swinney and Shona Robinson have not given testimony at the inquiry and have not been cross-examined. Without that, we will never have the full picture of what happened. And there is a further risk, Presiding Officer. If political decision-making is not examined, ministers will attempt to use the final report of the inquiry as proof that the problems were contained entirely within the Health Board and could not have been prevented by government intervention. That claim cannot be allowed to stand without proper scrutiny. We know that Jean Freeman has given evidence, and that is welcome, but she was appointed Health Secretary in 2019. We need those who were in office in 2015 to be answering questions too. I want to speak directly about the families. They are amongst the most remarkable people I have ever met in my life. I have the privilege of calling Kimberly Darroch a friend. And while the whistleblowers helped us to bring this to this point, we would not be where we are if it wasn't for the courage of the families who refused to stay silent. Kimberly has fought not because it will bring back her amazing daughter Millie Mayne, but she is determined that no other family should endure what she has. That takes unimaginable strength and courage. So to Kimberly and to all the families, thank you. The dignity you have shown has been extraordinary, and you have fought for years to protect others, and you are the very best of Scotland. A couple of other issues, Presiding Officer. While much of the attention, understandably, has been on the children, I don't think infections in adults has been given the same level of scrutiny that it deserves. Those families still do not have answers. There has been no independent oversight of their concerns, and they are being asked to trust the same system that has failed other families. And if they believe there is a link between infection and the loss of their loved ones, they deserve the truth and answers just like any other family. Finally, while attention is focused on the water supply, there must also be full scrutiny of the ventilation system and its potential link to infection and risk to life. Presiding Officer, when I say this is the biggest scandal in the history of the Parliament, let me be clear about what has happened. Parents who should have been focused solely on supporting their child through cancer treatment were instead met with denial, delay and institutional self-protection. Whistleblowers were ignored, gaslit, lied to and punished for speaking out. Families were dismissed, patronised and made to feel like they were making a fuss when they just wanted answers about their children. Clinicians and staff who raised concerns were bullied and victimised by the NHS managers who are paid for by the public purse, and powerful institutions chose their reputations over their responsibility to patients. The Health Board and SNP ministers denied, downplayed and delayed. They did not put patient safety first. They did not put families first. They closed ranks. So this isn't about the NHS frontline staff, the nurses, the doctors, the cleaners, the porters, who care with compassion and professionalism under immense pressure every day. They are not to blame. The failure of this lies with senior leadership and a culture of secrecy and poor governance enabled by incompetent ministers who repeatedly denied the scale of the problem and dismissed legitimate concerns. So yes, the public inquiry is vital and it must run its course, but it can't be used as a shield for secrecy or inaction on the issues that confront patients today. That is why I am asking for this Parliament to vote for two things. First, the release of all ministerial and officials' communication and discussions relating to the Queen Elizabeth scandal, and that steps are taken to ensure that none of the vital files, be they WhatsApp messages or messages on personal servers, are systematically deleted like we know this government likes to do. And secondly, that real investigation takes place into political decision-making, because people deserve to know what happened and ministers should be held to account. Families deserve answers. They deserve accountability. They deserve justice. And those direct questions that I posed to the Health Secretary must be answered in this debate today if they have to have a shred of credibility with the public. I move the motion in my name, and I urge MSPs, put aside your political affiliation and do what's right by patients and families and vote for this motion.
Thank you. I now call on Neil Gray to speak to and move Amendment 20561.1. Cabinet Secretary, up to 9 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this debate, and I move the amendment in my name. The matters before us today go to the heart of public trust and patient safety. And I begin my speech by extending my deepest sympathies to every family who has lost a loved one, to every patient who has suffered harm or distress connected to the issues being examined by this inquiry. No words spoken in this chamber can undo what they have endured, but it is essential that this Parliament acknowledges their pain, their courage and their determination to seek truth. Their persistence has been extraordinary. It is because of them that these matters are now subject to full independent scrutiny, with the determination that no other family has to suffer in the same way, and I pay tribute to every single one of them. Presiding Officer, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde was responsible for the delivery and oversight of the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital project. It was the largest hospital build in Scotland's history, designed to be a flagship for modern healthcare, serving patients for decades to come. However, when serious and deeply concerning allegations were brought to the Government's attention in 2018 about safety, construction standards, ventilation systems and the potential links to infection and patient harm, it became clear that those concerns could not be dealt with through internal reviews alone. That is why the Scottish Government established a statutory public inquiry to ensure that those affected could have their questions answered in a forum that is independent, rigorous and empowered by law. The Government's intention in doing so was clear and unequivocal, to uncover the full truth about what happened, why it happened and what lessons must be learned. Presiding Officer, before I turn to the substance of the motion today, I note again to this chamber two important points of clarity. Neither Scottish ministers nor indeed anyone in this chamber should prejudge the outcome of this inquiry or seek to influence the independent chair. That would be wholly inappropriate and indeed a breach the very principles set out in the Inquiries Act 2005. Secondly, the Police and the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service have independent responsibilities to investigate and prosecute as they see fit. There is a live police investigation ongoing into patient deaths, and for that reason I will not be commenting on any further on that particular matter. Presiding Officer, I now turn to the motion lodged by Mr Sarwar. I understand the motivation behind it. When something goes badly wrong in a project of this scale and significance, it is entirely reasonable to want every possible line of responsibility examined. However, while I recognise the concern that underpins the motion, I cannot support it, because it would be incompatible with the legal framework that governs this inquiry. All statutory public inquiries in Scotland operate under the Inquiries Act, which was passed by this Parliament. That Act exists to protect the independence, integrity and credibility of inquiries. It gives inquiry chairs powerful legal tools, the power to compel witnesses, to require the production of documents, to take evidence on oath and to determine what evidence is relevant to their terms of reference. Those powers are not held by ministers. They are held by the independent inquiry chair. Any member seeking to support the motion's attempt to influence the action of the chair is calling for the government to act in a manner incompatible with that legislation, which, of course, presiding officer, we cannot do. That separation in the Act is fundamental. It ensures that no government, present or future, can direct, restrict or shape an inquiry to suit political convenience. It ensures that the search for truth is not compromised by an external pressure, and it ensures that the families who have placed their trust in this process can have confidence that it is being conducted without fear or favour. To instruct or to attempt to instruct a statutory inquiry to examine particular categories of evidence after it has been established and is underway would be a breach of that framework. It would undermine the very independence that gives the inquiry its legitimacy. It is therefore not for Scottish ministers, or indeed for this Parliament, to decide what evidence Lord Brodie should or should not consider. That responsibility rests with him alone. I give way to Ms Bailey.
Briefly, Jackie Bailey.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary. You were asked a question about validation of every section of the hospital. That's not about the inquiry. That's about now, and you have a responsibility as Cabinet Secretary to provide assurance to the public.
Cabinet Secretary.
Ms Bailey, it is a matter for the inquiry. That Lord Brodie has instructed independent evidence as to the hospital's current infrastructure. That evidence was provided by Mr Poplet and goes into the detail of the situation currently before the hospital. So that is a matter for the inquiry, Presiding Officer. That is a matter.
Mr Sarwar, you've had an opportunity to state your case. I would be grateful if you were not making intervention from a position, Cabinet Secretary.
That is a matter for the inquiry to determine, and there are live inquiries underway which must be allowed the respect to conclude their business before we take a conclusion as to evidence before us. I give way finally to Daniel Johnson.
Daniel Johnson.
I'm grateful, but the Cabinet Secretary is mistaken. Those are questions about what happened. The question that Ms Bailey put to him is, what is the current status of the hospital? Are those facilities validated and declared safe or not? Yes or no?
Cabinet Secretary.
Officer, it is a matter for the inquiry. It is a matter. I'll come to this. It is a matter for Lord Brodie to determine the evidence that he seeks to have relevant to the terms of reference. He has received evidence from independent experts. No, I won't. Sorry, Mr Whittle. I've given way for a final time. He has taken evidence, independent evidence, as the current situation with the hospital. The government has also sought assurance from his as to the current safety of the hospital, and they have set out their consideration of the current safety of the hospital, which gives us assurance as to its safety. Presiding Officer, Lord Brodie and his team have led this inquiry in exactly the spirit that I have set out. The inquiry is not beholden to the Government, to the Health Board, to any political party. It is beholden only to the law, to the evidence and to the people affected by these events. Thousands of documents have been reviewed. Detailed technical evidence has been heard. Witnesses across the system, clinicians, engineers, managers, civil servants and ministers have had their evidence examined. Serious and troubling issues have emerged. And I do not shy away from that. But it is precisely because the issues are serious and it is so important that the inquiry is allowed to complete its work properly without interference or political direction. The Scottish Government has complied fully with the inquiry. We have provided all irrelevant evidence to its terms of reference that has been requested. That includes ministerial communications, briefings, submissions, minutes of meetings, cabinet papers and records, from the earliest conception of the hospital programme through the development of the business case, the construction phase and the improvements that followed. All ministerial decision-making connected to the project has already been made available at the request of the inquiry. Those documents have been supplied by testimony from senior officials and from former and current ministers. If Lord Brodie considers that further information, clarification or testimony is required, the Government will provide it, Presiding Officer. I can confirm that unequivocally today. Turning to the substance of the amendments from the Greens, I am sympathetic to the focus that has been placed on ensuring patient confidence is in safety, and to that regard I asked Healthcare Improvement Scotland in March last year to conduct a further review of the progress made by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde in meeting health and safety requirements and recommendations as set out in the action plan from the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital Assurance of Infection Prevention and Control inspection of June 2022. In addition, there was a focused inspection of the Emergency Department in July 2024 as part of the wider NHS GG&C Emergency Department review that resulted in a number of actions that have also been addressed. His subsequently confirmed that it was reassured by the response to that review by Greater Glasgow and Clyde, assurance that has continued through a series of further inspections. And taking this commitment to patient safety further, the Scottish Government has introduced a Patient Safety Charter and an additional part of the Patient Safety Commissioner for Scotland Act, taking into account the concerns and experiences that resulted in the proposals for Millie's Law. It is hugely important the work of the Commissioner leads to honesty, learning and improvement, and it is for that reason that the Government will support the Greens' amendment today. In relation to the Conservatives' amendment, for the same reasons regarding political interference in inquiries I've set out in regard to Mr Sarwar's motion, we cannot support this. However, I give Mr Whittle my assurance again that this Government is absolutely committed to transparency. I have been crystal clear with NHS boards of my expectations of protections for whistleblowers. I've set that out repeatedly to Mr Kerr when he has questioned me on this matter. And I'm clear that any further issues raised by patients, families and whistleblowers beyond the inquiry will indeed be listened to. Presiding Officer, the final hearings have now concluded. We are at a critical point in this process. The families who have waited so long for answers deserve nothing less than a report that is careful, thorough and that gets to the truth. But we must not preempt the inquiry's work, nor should we undermine its authority. When the report is published, Scottish ministers will consider its conclusions with the seriousness they demand. We will respond in full and we will take action wherever that is required to ensure the lessons are learned and that patient safety is strengthened.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Just to remind the Chamber, reactions to what's being said in the Chamber is one thing. I will not, though, accept running commentaries on what is being said. At this point, I invite Brian Whittle to speak to and move Amendment 20561.2. Around 7 minutes. Mr Whittle.
Presiding Officer, I don't want to be speaking in this debate because this debate has come about because of failure. A failure that has led to men, women and children dying unnecessarily in a building built and run by an organisation whose foundational purpose is to heal. And I have to say at this point how disappointed I am to see a lack of SNP Glasgow MSPs in the Chamber. For the vast majority of patients who have visited the Queen Elizabeth, their care is as excellent as the NHS is able to deliver, and the outcomes are as good as they would be in any hospital in Scotland. The staff who work in the Queen Elizabeth campus are as diligent and professional as any in the NHS. Their hard work should not be diminished. Just because there are broken parts does not mean the whole is broken. When we speak of this failure, the last thing any of us should want is anyone to cancel an appointment or avoid seeking help because in speaking about this issue, we have given the impression it is too dangerous to go. And on that point, the Cabinet Secretary's response to Jackie Bailey, when a direct question, is the hospital now safe for patients, he was unable to answer that question. How on earth can we expect patients to come to the hospital and feel safe? Of course I'll give way.
Cabinet Secretary.
I have no doubt that the hospital is safe. The question that I was asked by Jackie Bailey was something different that is subject to the terms of the inquiry. That is why I could not answer that in full detail. But yes, the hospital is safe.
Brian Whittle.
I shall stay seated.
Jackie Bailey.
Thank you so much, Presiding Officer. That indeed was not my question. I think the Cabinet Secretary is misinterpreting it. And if he paid attention to what was going on in the inquiry, he would know that the general rooms in the hospital have not been validated. It's his responsibility, would you not agree, that the hospital should be safe?
And through the Chair, Brian Whittle, and give you time back.
Well, the buck does stop with the Scottish Government. At the end of the day, they run that public service. But in that light, I am going to choose my words carefully in this debate. But I think ministers should not mistake that caution for a lack of anger on my part or on these benches. In their closing statement to the Scottish Hospital Inquiry, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde said, pressure, and I quote, pressure was applied to open the hospital on time and on budget. And it's now clear that hospital opened too early. It was not ready. Presiding Officer, in all conscience, we as an opposition, and quite frankly, this Parliament, cannot allow that statement to go by without comment or scrutiny. And at the least, we would expect some urgent action. We know that in 2015, the then Health Secretary, Shona Robeson, told the Health and Sport Committee categorically that an independent audit of the hospital would be completed before opening. We also know that did not happen. Who has the gravitas to put pressure on a hospital to open before safety checks are complete? Presiding Officer, that list cannot be long. What is really concerning is that the timing of the opening has been brought into question just before an election. The silence and obfuscation from the Scottish Government only serves to feed that growing disquiet and lack of trust. At best, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government are guilty of having a chronic lack of oversight or governance over the building and delivery of such a significant construction. And the worst-case scenario hardly bears thinking about. Because if, as has been levelled at the Scottish Government, they knew or were party to that pressure brought to bear on a hospital to open without the audit that Shona Robeson said would take place and subsequently didn't, just to help with an SNP election campaign, then they and the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde Board are guilty of gross negligence leading directly to the tragic deaths we have all heard about. I sincerely hope that that is not the case. That is why we have to ask that, given her position as Health Secretary when building commenced and that she was the First Minister when the hospital opened, that Nicola Sturgeon come to this chamber, give a statement and answer questions from colleagues, because Ms Sturgeon is uniquely placed to speak to this issue. Presiding Officer, across this chamber, I believe there is a general agreement that when it comes to health and social care, we shouldn't play politics. However, that willingness to put petty politics aside has to be grounded in an acceptance that where there is a need for genuine scrutiny and challenge, the Government, indeed the Health Service, will participate meaningfully in that scrutiny and in that debate. Time and again, though, when questions arise about a decision of when a project doesn't go to plan or when a scandal rears its head, politicians, patients and public all face the same brick wall. Then comes the years of campaigning, met by everything from obfuscation to outright denial, until slowly, inch by creeping inch, the truth reveals itself. It should not be like this, Presiding Officer. Of course, if the Scottish Government or health boards have a defence for failings, they should make that clear. But getting to the truth should not be harder than getting blood from a stone. Allowing years to go by and millions of pounds to be spent investigating before admitting the truth only compounds the original failure. Mistakes happen, Presiding Officer, and they can happen for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes those mistakes are impossible to see coming or impossible to avoid. But when they were seen coming, when they were avoidable, when there were consequences of poor decision or poor planning, there must be accountability, there must be responsibility, and there must be honesty. In any organisation, the culture flows from the top down. While the First Minister has criticised the culture in the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, he may wish to remember that his government sit atop the whole of Scotland's healthcare system. So if he wants to know how to change the NHS culture, maybe he should start looking a bit closer to home. By avoiding scrutiny in the latest scandals, by wrapping as much as possible into the latest inquiry, the Scottish Government seem hell-bent on ensuring the election is passed, to ensure they can hide behind the "let's wait for the inquiry" before needing to answer questions. We all speak about keeping politics out of health. By taking the stance the Government have, they are dragging politics into health, because we cannot be expected to let these catastrophic failures go by unquestioned. That would be gross dereliction of duty, letting down those so badly affected by these failings. Presiding Officer, the priority must be to restore confidence and trust for patients and staff alike. Silence, Presiding Officer, just will not cut it. We on these benches will not allow it. I move the amendment in my name, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Whittle. I now call Gillian Mackay to speak to and move Amendment 20561.3 around 6 minutes. Ms Mackay.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I'd like to begin, as others have, by paying tribute to the tireless efforts of the families who have campaigned so hard to shine a light on what went wrong at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. They've often faced shocking treatment, been labelled as troublesome or difficult, while they were just trying to get justice for their loved ones. The focus of my contribution today will be on the impact on those families, current and future patients and staff working at the hospital, all of whom may be suffering extreme distress while the revelations about who knew what and when are made public. For the families, having to go through what they have, let alone having their family stories and their grief played out in public, is something I'm sure none of us can even imagine. Having to then fight to have their voices heard and go through a long public inquiry is in itself traumatic. I can't imagine how it must feel to be watching what's going on in Parliament, and there are clearly things that have gone wrong, issues with water and ventilation, as well as the issues around decision-making. The question now is, how do we demand accountability and start to rebuild the trust that has been so horribly fractured by this whole episode? And to understand the impact this has had on trust, we need to examine the testimonies of those who have been affected. Cancer diagnoses are life-changing traumatic events. Patients and their families should not have to worry about the safety of the hospital in which they're being treated. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde itself admitted in its closing submission that, and I quote, "A patient diagnosed with such a condition and the families supporting them must have confidence in the buildings and the systems within them. They should be able to devote all of their attention to their treatment, not concerns about the environment in which that treatment takes place. Unfortunately, as we all know, that was not the case for some patients at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. In a recent BBC News article, one mum whose daughter contracted an infection when she was little said, and I quote, "A hospital is supposed to be your safe place where you go to ask for help." She says she still feels traumatised and lives in fear that her child will relapse and have to go back into hospital. As a parent, having a child admitted to hospital because they're unwell is frightening enough, but to have the weight of the fear of another infection hanging over you must be unbearable. Tragically, she and another mother whose child caught an infection say they still live with survivor's guilt, that their children are alive while others died, and no parent should have to carry that burden. After having experienced such pain, fear and trauma, to then have to campaign for the truth about what happened to your child is unthinkable. We owe it to those families to get to the bottom of what happened, to not use this as a political football, but to shine a light on the inquiry, pay heed to its findings, and keep asking questions of government and the Health Board about how we ensure this never happens again. Although extensive... I'll take the intervention from Carol Mockin.
Briefly, Carol Mockin.
Thank you. I really thank the member for her contribution and mentioning the families in the way that she did. It's much appreciated. I wonder, given what the member is saying, if she will be supporting our motion tonight to make sure we get immediate disclosure of the information that we need.
Gillian Mackay.
I thank Carol Mockin for her intervention, and we will be supporting the motion at decision time. Although extensive remedial work has been done to the building, people will be frightened and worried by the series of headlines about infections, and it's up to both NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and the Scottish Government to reassure people that when they're treated for serious illness like cancer, they will be safe. The poor communication between the Health Board and patients and their families has been a standout revelation during this inquiry. Likewise, clinical staff deserve to know that they're working in a safe environment so they can get on with the incredible work they do. Their efforts should not be hampered by working in a building which threatens their patients' safety. And frankly, they shouldn't have to worry about that. It isn't their job, and they've been failed too. Whistleblowing staff have also been let down. One microbiologist said she felt discouraged from speaking up at infection control meetings. Another senior doctor said she was advised by a senior colleague to pipe down or she would find things hard professionally. She's previously said that she'd been flagging concerns about the building since 2014 and was advised not to put anything in writing. Staff need to know that when they raise concerns, these will be listened to. Although NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has accepted that its previous criticisms of the whistleblowers were neither helpful nor fair, it's clear that the whistleblowing system failed, and this will not be conducive to others coming forward with concerns in the future. NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has a lot of work to do to assure staff that whistleblowers will be protected and, most importantly, taken seriously. Much has been made of the fact that NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has admitted that pressure was applied to open the hospital on time and on budget, and it's now clear that the hospital opened too early. The board has since clarified that this was internal pressure, but it begs the question: how have we reached the point that a health board feels so under pressure to deliver that it sacrifices patient safety for the sake of remaining on budget? What were the series of decisions taken, and how can we prevent anything like this ever happening again? The inquiries that are ongoing should rightly be able to conclude in their own time, and any conclusions need to be acted on quickly and comprehensively. We need to make sure, however, that before those recommendations are available, that we ensure anyone attending the hospital has the full confidence that they are safe. And I think the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Secretary must lead the way on this. And I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Ms Mackay. And I call Cole Hamilton around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak in this very important debate. I'm grateful too for Anas Sarwar to make opposition time available for this. But it shouldn't be left to opposition parties to make time of it. This is a scandal that has rumbled on, as we've heard, for more than 7 years now. And at every point, at every development, this Parliament, this government should have had the recognition of the parliamentary place for this and brought it to Parliament and explained the decisions taken and the developments as they stood, and indeed given reassurance to patients and staff of safety. I want to begin with the families, as everyone else has done, affected by this awful situation. These are families who trusted our health system, who rightly expected their loved ones to be treated with care in a safe environment. Not only have they had to endure incredible trauma and heartbreaking loss, but they have been forced to endure years of unanswered questions, made to fight not only for the truth, but simply to be listened to, forced to campaign while grieving deaths that should never have happened. And, Presiding Officer, we must also thank the staff whose bravery has been manifest today in the whistleblowing, in the recognition that they too have suffered ill effects of a contaminated water supply at the Queen Elizabeth. When it opened in 2015, this hospital was intended to be a flagship, a symbol of modern world-class care, the jewel in a crown of our health service. Instead, it became the site of contaminated water systems, inadequate ventilation and fatal infections. Vulnerable children were exposed to avoidable risk. Some lost their lives. Others suffered harm that could and should have been prevented. The Scottish Hospitals Inquiry has revealed not just a single failure, but a catalogue of failures in the design of the hospital, in its construction, infection control, governance and oversight. There were grave errors in decision-making, and then a failure, an abject failure by this government to take accountability. And there are serious questions to be answered here. As far back as March 2018, 3 children were being treated for infections likely linked to problems with the water supply at the hospital. In September that same year, child cancer patients were moved to a different ward due to water supply problems again. We know that senior doctors at the hospital raised concerns about risks to patient safety at the hospital, but they all fell on deaf ears. As a result, people died, including 10-year-old Millie Mayne, whose mother has since campaigned tirelessly for justice and for answers. Today's motion rightly condemns the culture of secrecy and cover-up that has characterised this scandal and too many NHS scandals that have taken place under this government. Time and again, families were kept in the dark, concerns minimalised and, crucially, warnings not acted upon. At the weekend, John Swinney himself admitted that, and I quote, "It does look like families and patients who acquired infections while being treated at this hospital were lied to." The instinct too often was to manage reputational risk rather than confront uncomfortable truths and own up to where mistakes were made. The inquiry has raised serious concerns about how information flowed or failed to flow between health boards, officials and ministers. Key questions still remain unanswered. Who knew what? What did they know? Why were the hospitals opened prematurely despite the manifest safety concerns we've all heard about today? And why have families had to fight for years for answers that they should have been given within days? These are not administrative questions. They are political ones. And it is right that questions are asked of those who wielded power at the time are brought to account. If political pressure influenced the premature opening of this hospital, then that, Presiding Officer, has to be examined. If communications were withheld, delayed or managed to control fallout, that too must be examined. If decisions were shaped by the optics of the situation rather than by patient safety, then Parliament and the public deserve to know why. No government should ever be allowed to hide behind the process when lives have been lost, not ever. Transparency is not optional, it is a moral obligation, which is why the government must commit now to full disclosure of all communications and of documents connected to the events at this hospital. Families should not have to fight through freedom of information requests and overcome legal barriers to get the truth about the events that resulted in the deaths of their loved ones. They are not asking for sympathy. They are not asking for kind words. They are demanding real accountability and change, and they are right to do so. Presiding Officer, we must learn from these failures so that they are never repeated. They must include independent oversight for hospital safety and design and lines of accountability, and a culture where whistleblowers and families are listened to and their concerns treated with the respect and seriousness they deserve and then acted upon. And, Presiding Officer, it should go without saying that patient safety must always come before political reputation. The families affected by the failures at this hospital have shown extraordinary courage in their pursuit of the truth. The least that this government owes them is transparency accountability and a commitment to change so that something like this is never, ever allowed to happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Gough-Hamilton. We now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 6 minutes. I call Cara Mochan to be followed by Claire Hockey. Ms Mochan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Public trust in governance and decision-making, whether at a local or national level, is crucial for our institutions and democracy. Transparency and accountability are equally important, and I think, Presiding Officer, we in this chamber, we would all agree those working in public service must strive to ensure these values are upheld. In 2015, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital campus opened its doors for the first time, celebrated as a super hospital and welcomed as one of the most advanced healthcare facilities in the world. Yet, we move 10 years later and this flagship hospital faces serious scandal. Not only because the contamination in the hospital's water and ventilation system caused serious infection in child cancer patients and 4 deaths, but also because the following secrecy, cover-up and silencing of staff who tried to expose the truth. And the Cabinet Secretary is shying away from answering questions related to the here and now. Presiding Officer, families were then gaslighted, dismissed and denied the truth, and we do not want that to happen again. There are many failings we can discuss today, failings in leadership, failings in accountability, failings in transparency. Firstly, the board failed to listen to the families, doctors and whistleblowers who raised concerns from the beginning about problems with the water and ventilation system. The public inquiry heard first-hand accounts of management attempts to silence, threaten and belittle staff. And it's clear that whistleblowing procedures were not followed. The growing culture of ignoring staff and refusing to act on their concerns raises serious questions about management structures and about the leadership of our NHS. And it also really raises concern about this SNP's government's oversight of our most valuable public asset. Problems with water systems were identified in 2015 and again in 2017, yet the Scottish Government claims it was first made aware of this in March 2018. But as my colleague Anna Sarwar has said, there are serious questions over whether this is actually true. We need some truth around this area. Now, given the Government was unaware or says it was unaware of such issues in its brand new super hospital, it is clear that they failed to provide the oversight and effective leadership required in government if this is the case. Secondly, proper procedure failed and the hospital was opened before it was ready. The failure to carry out proper checks and balances resulted in the premature opening of a facility which was not fit for purpose. Evidence to the inquiry shows that the risk of waterborne infection was foreseeable and it had been raised, but it was not acted upon. It was not acted upon. This was a serious error in judgment, and the pressure to open the hospital on time and within budget, whether this came from within the hospital or from above, must be heavily scrutinised, and it is our job here in Parliament to scrutinise these issues. All those involved in decision-making, be that operational or political, must be held to account on this, and this is why we discuss this today. The culture of secrecy and cover-up must come to an end. Thirdly, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde failed to accept that the water and ventilation systems could be the cause of infections. It failed to admit serious errors in judgment, and it failed to take accountability. In doing so, it prevented transparency and withheld the truth from patients and families. Staff were neglected, families were ignored, and the public were denied the truth. The reality is that we're here today because the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital was allowed to open before it should have. Before it should have. This must be something that we question. Families were denied the truth about the role of the hospital in causing infections and deaths of patients. and the Scottish Government are refusing to take any accountability for the errors made under its watch. This is what we must discuss. Accountability. They were accountable for what was happening in our NHS. I cannot begin to imagine the pain and trauma those affected by this scandal have faced. And they're brave to have spoken out. To lose a child to an avoidable death or having them suffer a severe infection is one thing, but to be denied the truth about the true cause of their death or infection is quite another. Patients and families are angry, and they should be. What they seek now is truth, and they seek justice. Presiding Officer, this is what they deserve. I urge the Government to authorise the immediate full disclosure and preservation of the communications relating to the contaminated water and inadequate ventilation systems, the premature opening of the hospital and any further communications relating to the issues we are discussing here today. By not publishing those documents, we risk abandoning transparency, diminishing the public's trust and repeating the same mistakes. There were problems with the hospital from the very beginning. Long waiting times, staff vacancies and poor infrastructure. The SNP cannot deny their incompetence in overseeing the development and opening of a hospital that will go on to have so many problems. If the Scottish Government have nothing to hide, then they should provide it. Providing full transparency over this matter is the least the Scottish Government can do for these whistleblowers and families, and is least the patients, families and staff deserve. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Mochan. I call Claire Hockey to be followed by Davy Russell. Ms Hockey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I remind members of my entry in the Register of Members' Interests, which shows I hold a bank nurse contract with NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. And I would like to begin, as others have, by expressing my deepest sympathies to all of those who are grieving the loss of a loved one in the circumstances we are discussing today. Patients, families and whistleblowers have shown incredible tenacity and dignity as they have shared their testimony, campaigned tirelessly for justice and made every effort to ensure the truth is determined. A hospital should be a safe place where people seek not only medical help but reassurance, care and comfort throughout their treatment. And relatives should feel confident leaving their loved ones in the care of the NHS. And that, Presiding Officer, can only be provided in a trusted environment. Patient safety is one of the Government's key priorities, and it's fundamental that patients and their families who use our hospitals are reassured that they're accessing safe clinical environments. As an MSP who has constituents that attend as patients and who work in the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, it's critically important to me that they can have confidence in the ability of the hospital to operate safely. Rightly, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde have offered, and I quote, a sincere and unreserved apology to patients and families affected by the events under investigation in the hospital's inquiry. But I know that for many, including colleagues across this chamber, that simply isn't enough without thorough and comprehensive assurance. It was reassuring to read the independent evidence of the expert Andrew Poplett. He provided evidence to Lord Brodie's inquiry in September last year, and he concluded that the hospital's current procedures for managing the water system are safe and suitable, and currently extremely well managed, and that significant improvements have been made in the hospital's water system. However, the fact remains that people have been badly let down in the past, and lessons must be absolutely learned as a result. Only robust investigation will get us answers to ensure that families get the truth that they want and need. This is precisely why the Scottish Government established a public inquiry led by Lord Brodie, which I have every confidence in will provide the scrutiny and the truth that is required by families affected and by everyone else. While the hospital's inquiry is underway, it's completely inappropriate for ministers to comment on or to narrate what's going on around the issues that it's investigating. And not only would this be completely inappropriate for ministers to seek to intervene or suppress any inquiries, preempt their findings or do anything other than allow the process to continue, it would be unlawful for them to do so. The inquiry being held under the UK-wide Inquiries Act 2005, and I would like to take a moment to discuss that as we're talking about what is now a well-established piece of legislation. Before it came into force, at least 10 different pieces of legislation had been used to provide a statutory basis for inquiries in the UK. The Act and the subsequent Inquiries Scotland rules from 2007 have provided a range of important provisions, including giving an inquiry's chair the power to compel witnesses to attend or documents to be produced, for evidence to be taken under oath, a statutory duty to secure public access to evidence and documents, and the ability for court participants to recover reasonable legal expenses, helping them to meaningfully participate in proceedings. The decision to establish the Scottish Hospitals Inquiry under the 2005 Act was therefore a significant and important one for these reasons. But perhaps the key provision in the Act that is the initial establishment of the terms of reference being the last point of ministerial input or influence before any inquiry concludes. Once this happens, inquiries are completely independent of ministers. This is written into the legislation for very good reason, and it's essential for them to be able to operate in a truly independent manner. When my opposition colleagues lined up to welcome the then Cabinet Secretary for Health's intention to establish a statutory inquiry under the Act, I remember Mr Sarwar in particular stressing the point that the inquiry had to be genuinely independent, and he was absolutely correct. But this is a point that should be very familiar to colleagues, Presiding Officer, as it has been very clearly and repeatedly stated in this chamber, not least by the Health Secretary Neil Gray last March when he made a statement on the Hospital Inquiry's interim report. It's absolutely, of course.
I thank Claire Hockey for taking the intervention. Does she recognise that reassuring the public about patient safety and what's happening in the hospital today does not contradict the role of the inquiry? So patients today have a right to know if the ward and the units have been validated and therefore are safe. That does not contradict the investigations of the inquiry. That should be a basic requirement of government to give that reassurance.
So as I referenced in my speech earlier, Lord Brodie had already instructed someone to make inquiries about the safety of the hospital, and they came back and reported that they felt the hospital, certainly water safety, was being maintained. It's absolutely fundamental inquiries are able to operate transparently and reach conclusions that are not influenced by ministers or any other type of vested interest. When Lord Brodie spoke ahead of the first diet of hearings in the hospital inquiry, he spoke first of patients and their families. He said this was his first priority, and it was to understand their experiences and to use that to inform subsequent lines of investigation. And so, as I began my speech, Presiding Officer, I will finish by bringing my focus back to them. I sincerely hope that when the inquiry's final conclusions and recommendations are published, they're able to finally gain a sense of closure, of being heard, and feel like their questions have been answered. For their sake, Lord Brodie must be given time and space to consider all the evidence and complete his work and get to the truth that they deserve.
Thank you, Ms Hockey. I would remind members that it is backbench speeches of up to 6 minutes. There is no time in hand. I call Davy Russell to be followed by Annie Wells. Mr Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My heart is heavy here, thinking about the families affected who have had to endure through this unavoidable tragedy. The Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, designed to be a flagship, and it should have been hit the ground running, but it saddens me to say it's now infamous. It's more like the Titanic. Children died, adults died, many caught serious infections on top of the illnesses they went into hospital with. These families and people put their trust in Scotland's health service, but were badly let down. Not by the excellent and hard-working staff, I must say. It's a tragedy, it's shameful, it's disgraceful and inexcusable, as this could have been avoided. This is what happens when a government applies pressure for political reasons, where it totally disregards a report that warned about the high risk of infection for vulnerable patients undergoing treatment. Let's face it, they come into hospital to try and get better, but alas, that didn't happen for these individuals who died. The way I see it is one of three things happened. Firstly, is that someone was aware of the report, received the report, filed it, did nothing, in which case we are looking at a case of criminal negligence. Secondly, someone looked at the report, didn't understand it, did nothing with it, in which case we are looking at a case of criminal incompetence. That's if there is such a thing, because I'm not quite sure. However, the SNP hierarchy of the period will be hoping that there's not such a thing. And thirdly, presiding officer, that someone looked at this report, understood exactly what it said. It would put the most vulnerable at risk and pressed on regardless of the consequences, with the opening of the hospital because it suited the political aims of the Scottish Government at the time, in which case we are looking at just plain criminality. None of these things would have happened if the government of the day put the patients and the most vulnerable in society at the heart of their decisions. The old motto, safety first, certainly was not considered or applied here. But replaced with secrecy, denial, untruths and misinformation, their old adage, I suggest, would be, it wasn't me, it was a bad boy that done it and he ran away, but if we were independent, we'd be all right. Presiding officer, this is part of a wider pattern of non-accountability from this SNP government. Right, the SNP government is currently being taken to court for not disseminating information requested by its own Information Commissioner. Despite having more than 10,000 extra civil servants to process these types of things since the pandemic, we should sack them all and give us 10,000 new nurses. The Justice Secretary misled Parliament but keeps her job because it's not quite severe enough. Well, you think what you want about that. I have a letter here from Shona Robinson where she claims, she claims that fiddling around with tax bands are not intended to fool anyone. When it's worth only a mere 9 pence a day to some of my constituents, and they're actually having a laugh. This is not serious government. It's just keeping the dishes spinning and keep the hype going. And the current Health Minister, when every single one of my constituents knows that when they phone the ambulance service, it's sometimes quicker to take a taxi to the emergency unit rather than waiting in the ambulance. Because the Health Minister hides behind mutilated statistics that do not reflect the sorry state of the NHS waiting list. However, on their side, their weak arguments in defence are always put in a nice, plausible way. Basically, to con the public, they think the public don't know any better. Treating my fellow Scots with contempt. Isn't it true, presiding officer, that the standard SNP story is to manipulate circumstances and data and then announce that they're doing a good job? I think they actually believe their own hype. This Parliament wasn't created to be like the Russian Kremlin. My fellow Scots deserve better. If patients are misled on how long they can expect to wait to receive a hip replacement, shame on the Scottish Government. And if sick children are put at risk because of certain politicians want to have a bit of good press, shame on them. This SNP cabal, who have no interest in accountability, no interest in improving things, and for anyone other than themselves, should have a real good look at themselves, as history will not judge them kindly.
Thank you, Mr Russell. I call Annie Wells to be followed by Emma Harper. Ms Wells.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland is now confronting what many rightly regard as one of the most serious healthcare failures in recent memory. After years of denial, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde has now accepted that contaminated water systems at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital were, on balance of probabilities, linked to serious infections in child cancer patients and to deaths. That admission did not come quickly, and it did not come voluntarily, and it didn't come with a cost. For years, families fought simply to have their experiences recognised. They were not asking for headlines or politics, they were asking for honesty. Instead, they encountered delay, deflection and disbelief, while officials explored every possible explanation except the one staring them in the face. Now, following closing submissions to the Scottish Hospitals Inquiry, the position has shifted dramatically. And while legal and political consequences will continue to unfold, our responsibility in this chamber is clear: to ensure transparency, accountability and justice for those who were failed. For years, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde insisted there was no causal link between the hospital environment and patient infections. That position has now been abandoned. In its closing submissions, the board accepts that it is more likely than not that some bloodstream infections were connected to the hospital environment, particularly the water system, and that infection rates fell only after remedial work in 2018, and that whistleblowers were not adequately listened to. Those are not minor concessions. They fundamentally alter the narrative. This hospital opened to patients just 10 days before a general election, and at that time Nicola Sturgeon was First Minister, John Swinney was Deputy Minister and Shona Robinson was Cabinet Secretary for Health. For years the SNP denied the problem and opposed a public inquiry into the hospital before eventually U-turning. They ignored safety concerns and dismissed families who were grieving. Warnings were minimised and whistleblowers were called troublemakers rather than listened to. 84 child cancer patients were infected and at least 2 died. Police Scotland is now investigating multiple deaths linked to the QEUH campus. These families deserve answers, Cabinet Secretary, not deflection, denial or silence. The SNP must be honest about who put pressure on NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde to open this hospital before it was safe, what ministers knew and when they knew it. This was a flagship government project that was a centrepiece of the SNP's 2015 general election campaign. So, frankly, no one believes that ministers had zero role in overseeing it or making these decisions. And if that was the case, then it is gross negligence. Those responsible, whether in government or the Health Board, must be held to account. But, Presiding Officer, this is not only about the actions of ministers, it's about culture. We have heard repeated evidence of defensive, closed management culture, clinicians discouraged from putting concerns in writing, senior experts dismissed and parents reassured while they quietly closed wards around about them. Families have described being misled and dismissed while children became seriously ill. The father of victim Molly Cuddihy said that the Health Board was warned for years about these issues. That is not a system learning from mistakes. It is a system protecting itself. That is why this motion matters. We now know the hospital opened before it was ready. We know microbial risks were identified, and yet patients were admitted regardless. The First Minister has acknowledged cultural problems at the Health Board and that families appear to have been lied to. That is significant, but acknowledgement is not accountability. He has done nothing to hold these same health bodies accountable, and the Health Secretary has ignored their call to put the board into special measures. That is why the call for full disclosure and preservation of all relevant communications is essential, not optional. Communications relating to water contamination, ventilation failures, the opening of the hospital and the handling of infections must be released in full. No organisation should be above scrutiny, no reputation should come before patient safety, and no family should have to fight for years to be believed. These families are not seeking scapegoats. They want recognition, change and assurance that this will never happen again. And if we fail, the greatest injustice of all would be to allow such a failure to be repeated. That is why, given her role as Health Secretary and First Minister at the time, Nicola Sturgeon should now come forward and make a personal statement to this Parliament, setting out what she knew, what she was advised and what actions were undertaken under her leadership that she took. That is what our motion calls for, and it is what the victims want. Kimberly Darroch, the mother of 10-year-old Millie Main, who died after contracting an infection while being treated for leukaemia in the hospital, said, "I do believe Nicola Sturgeon knows something, and my message to her is to come forward and be honest. Presiding Officer, I agree with Millie Main's mother, and that's why I would urge every MSP to support our motion as a result. Presiding Officer, this Parliament owes them nothing less.
Thank you, Ms Wells. I call Emma Harper to be followed by Paul Sweeney. Ms Harper.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First, like others, I too extend my deepest sympathies to families involved. I speak in support of the Cabinet Secretary's amendment today, but I have to say the fact that Labour have brought this motion here today while Lord Brodie is considering the massive material before him and the ink on the final submissions and the statements is barely dry, it says a great deal about their priorities and about their desperate political agenda. I don't think it is in any way appropriate for this Parliament or members of it to seek to interfere or intervene in that independent inquiry. I don't think we've got time, actually. I don't think there's much time in hand. This is an inquiry that was set up under the legislation passed by the UK Government in 2005. And our First Minister said in this chamber last week, Lord Brodie must have the opportunity to consider and reflect on the evidence and to set out his conclusions. I completely agree with that, and I have to say, as an MSP who represents a constituent involved in campaigning for health services in my own region and in her area, she was the target of fabricated and unauthorised quotes on the Labour Party leaflet. And a leaflet that incidentally was still being delivered through letterboxes last week, despite Labour's promise to withdraw it from the circulation. No, I'm not going to take any interventions. I think you should be apologising to the constituents.
Always
I want an
chair,
inquiry,
Ms.
certainly
Harper.
want an inquiry, an independent inquiry as set up by the SNP's own Cabinet Secretary for Health at the time, an inquiry that does get to the truth of what happened at the Queen Elizabeth and at the Royal Hospital for Children, and as the inquiry's own remit states, ensure that any past mistakes are not repeated in the future NHS infrastructure projects. So without prejudicing that inquiry, I wholeheartedly welcome the acknowledgement before it by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde that their response and behaviour to the whistleblowers who raised substantive and serious concerns was wholly unacceptable. I'm pleased that there's been a change in NHS Greater Glasgow policies and how it responds to issues of concern being raised by staff. And without going into the specifics of what the inquiry has been looking at, and again I encourage Labour Party to consider the people that work on the front line in our health service and see how it functions every hour of every day. If there are flaws and problems and challenges and issues and mistakes or miscalculations being made and impacting on the delivery of safe and patient-centred health services that serves our people, they should and must be listened to, not denigrated, ignored and have their professionalism questioned by senior management. I worked in the National Health Service and in healthcare in the USA for many years as a registered nurse and clinical educator, and I know that the plans and processes that are put in place can go wrong. What is meant to happen on paper is not always what happens in the real world of day-to-day healthcare. And through risk management processes, significant adverse event and near-miss reporting and root cause analysis review, steps are taken to identify and put measures in place to identify, fix and learn from these issues. And it's the staff who need to be most respected and most involved when it comes to that crucial function. And I have to say again, without specific reference to the ongoing inquiry, if a management team find themselves being contacted by numerous whistleblowers on a single subject, it is clear that the team has badly managed their ongoing relationship with the staff, which should be at the core of continuously improving our health service. That the end result of the breakdown of that relationship, in this case in an inquiry that has now lasted many years, should be a lesson to every organisation in the country, but particularly in our health service, of how important listening to staff and whistleblowers is. It took courage and bravery for those people to speak up, people like Drs Reading, Peters and Inkster, health professionals who raised their concerns with management. And as the board stated in front of Lord Brodie, it is accepted it did not place appropriate emphasis on the listening to staff and encouraging the raising of concerns. To any health service staff watching this today, working in maintenance, cleaning, catering, nursing, allied health professionals, doctors, every single one of the staff who are saving lives and making our society a healthier place to live on behalf of our country, I'd say if you have concerns about patient safety, if you see something that needs reporting, if you hear something that does not sound right, please report it, please speak up. Because we, and I hope there is at least unanimity in the chamber on this point, we all want a health service where the thousands and thousands of people who are in our NHS are listened to. I'm closing. That's it. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Harper. I call Paul Sweeney to be followed by Joe Fitzpatrick. Mr Sweeney.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Having listened to speeches today, particularly from the government side, it seems clear to me that the government lives in fear of the cost of truth to our country. And they ought to be thinking about what the cost of lies and defence of misinformation truly is to our country. Because every one of our families, every citizen of this country, when they are faced with the horrible circumstances of a relative, a friend, maybe themselves being admitted to hospital in a crisis, want to have some degree of certainty that the health service is equipped to meet their needs, to save their lives. I can't imagine the horror of realising not only that someone's child, someone's relative died, but then they died because of a system of failure, because of lies and a lack of accountability. And this applies not just in the health service, it applies across government. It's a cultural problem that's crept in our country, slowly, almost imperceptibly, over many years. We are a country that often tries to pride itself on being open, transparent, that the Parliament itself was founded with those principles, that we passed legislation like the Freedom of Information Act that would cast a light on the workings of government. But it feels increasingly that in recent years it's a clique, a closed shop, a system of self-preservation for those at the top, whether it's in the government or whether it's in the bureaucracy, and not for those who we are elected to serve in our democracy. A culture that looks inwards, treating politics as a game of insider and outsider, where the concerns of the insider happen to be more important than the people they are meant to serve. And I think that cuts to the core of every aspect of what's gone wrong in the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. I came from a shipbuilding background and happy to give way.
Jackson Carla.
Is an illustration of that not the number of insurance claims that have been settled within the health service? When I first came in here, there were very few. Now there are tens of millions. There's a rush to offer compensation, but not to have accountability of those who actually were responsible for the problem in the first place. Is that not part of the culture to which he refers?
Paul Sweeney.
I think the member for Eastwood makes a very good point. It's a symptom of a wider disease. To curtail and suppress rather than hold accountable, go to the root cause of the problem and try and avoid the consequences, because those consequences are, in many cases, lives being lost unnecessarily. I said that I worked in the shipbuilding background. I remember distinctly in my very first week joining the shipyard, there was a huge sign above one of the sheds saying, "Lives depend on us doing our job right." And I think that is important to remember, that in project management, in any big project, there is a moral obligation to be accountable, to be honest, because the protection of human life is at the core of projects, whether it's in healthcare, construction, aerospace, shipbuilding. They are high-stakes projects, and there's a total responsibility to act with integrity at all levels, in management and commissioning. And if any perverse incentive exists to ensure that safety is overridden, that has got to be nipped in the bud, and that simply did not happen in this case. There were other expedient measures or pressures at play. We know that much. We know that pressure existed. We know that the final product was not safe, that it caused harm to the public, it caused unnecessary death. Where is the accountability for that failure? It's no good just acknowledging it. Where is the system of accountability? Where is the deterrence so that those perverse behaviours do not occur again? How can we have confidence as parliamentarians, even as members of the public, that that will not happen again? whether it's a ferry that doesn't work, whether it's a hospital that causes death. Myriad other symptoms exist across the public sector in Scotland that are cause for concern, raised routinely in this Parliament. We have to understand what the underlying behaviour, the underlying culture is there. How do we address that? The protection and preservation of human life in our country should be our overriding concern. And to simply have it dismissed that we are acting ultra vires somehow as parliamentarians and holding account in the government for that situation here is appalling to me. Can members of this Parliament not show some degree of pride in their work here and what they're meant to be doing? That is important to me, certainly, and I hope it's important to others. There are ethical dilemmas all over these kind of complex projects, but we can never compromise on standards, rushing to meet deadlines by skipping quality or safety checks. Even in basic routine maintenance, we see this. One of my colleagues in Glasgow, Councillor Redmond, George Redmond, was admitted to the Glasgow Royal Infirmary where even the showers weren't working. Basic infection control, prevention of disease failing on an ongoing basis in the city today. Where is the accountability for that failure? It's simply not good enough to say we acknowledge that sometimes things might go wrong. Where is the root cause analysis? Where is the escalation? Why is it not on a wall in the Cabinet Secretary's office in red pen with a daily, hourly report on what's going on to fix that problem? Where is the system of accountability? We have constantly the circular feedback loop, the doom loop between health boards, IJBs, ministers, parliamentarians, but none of it ever results in consequences. And that is where we really need to question our own role in our public life. And I hope that parliamentarians will think on this, regardless of the inquiry and what it concludes. I think some matters are self-evident, and they're certainly obvious to me, and they should be obvious to colleagues across the chamber today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Sweeney. I call Joe Fitzpatrick to be followed by Stephen Kerr. Mr Fitzpatrick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate and to add my condolences to those who lost loved ones. Presiding Officer, we must not lose focus on the patients, the families and the whistleblowers who have campaigned tirelessly for justice as part of the Scottish Hospitals inquiry. The pain and suffering felt by patients at Queen Elizabeth University Hospital and that of their families is unthinkable. Those who have lost loved ones and have subsequently fought to establish the truth have my full support. It should not happen in our NHS. The patients deserved better. We, as parliamentarians, expect and demand better. Full transparency is required to ensure those impacted get the answers that they deserve. I am therefore grateful to Lord Brodie and the wider inquiry for ensuring the voices of patients and their families are being heard. I also welcome the First Minister's commitment to acting on the recommendations of Lord Brodie when the full report is published. Presiding Officer, I would like to use some of my time today to also mention those impacted by the actions of Sam Elgimel during his employment at NHS Tayside as a surgeon between 1995 and 2014. Many of Mr Elgimel's former patients are constituents of mine, and I know a number of colleagues in this chamber will also represent those impacted by the actions of the former employee at Ninewells in my constituency. Presiding Officer, it is crucial that every effort is made to ensure that those living with the consequences of Mr Elgimel's actions get the answers that they deserve. I was therefore pleased that the Scottish Government established a public inquiry and an independent clinical review to give patients the option of having their personalised review of their care, something which wouldn't have happened if it had just been a public inquiry alone. Yes, absolutely.
Brian Whittle.
I'm very grateful to the member for giving me, but doesn't that specific illustrate the problem we have here? Because the whistleblower came forward in 2009 and Elgimel was allowed to leave in 2013 and the inquiries only started in 2024. That actually speaks to the problem we have just now.
Joe Fitzpatrick.
I think it absolutely speaks to why it is so important that those who have been impacted, some of whom are my constituents, and some of those are people who I know on a personal basis, get the answers they deserve fully. I think it is also, I think it's to be welcomed that, as well as having the independent inquiry, that the independent clinical reviews were able to take place alongside that, something that obviously the government had to work hard to make sure was able to happen, because as I think we all know, a public inquiry will tend to look at the generalities, whereas for many of the patients of Mr El Jamel, they were looking at what happened to them specifically, and I think that's really good. And I know that it's an issue that certainly my colleagues in Tayside have worked really well on a non-party political basis. I saw Liz Smith there earlier, and she's one of the ones who's worked really hard on this issue, absolutely on a non-party political basis, and I think that's really important. So, moving back, I welcome the Honourable Lord Weir and Professor Stephen Wigmore as chairs of the Public Inquiry and Independent Clinical Reviews, respectively, supported by expert neurosurgeons. I know that the Health Secretary has met with a number of former patients, and I understand that he was left in no doubt about the anger and pain that has been caused. I welcome this engagement from the Health Secretary. Once more, I emphasise that we must not lose focus on the patients and their families. Presiding Officer, the Scottish NHS is something that we should all be extremely proud of. All of us in this chamber and everyone watching across the country will have benefited enormously from the work of our incredible NHS workforce. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our NHS staff who work tirelessly every day. They are a credit to Scotland. However, as we've heard today, sometimes things don't go as planned. And when that happens, which is, it's important to note, in a small minority of cases, it is very important, it's imperative that those impacted get the answers that they deserve. In the most serious cases, such as Sam El Jamel in Tayside or at Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, a public inquiry allows for an independent review to get answers on behalf of patients, with recommendations to ensure that it never happens again and restore faith in our NHS that may have been lost as a consequence. The independence of a public inquiry is paramount. Presiding Officer, I want to reinstate my support for full transparency in all of the cases mentioned in the Chamber today. As Minister for Parliamentary Business, I introduced the Lobbying Scotland Act 2016 to ensure openness and accountability, the founding principles of our national parliament. And 10 years on, I welcome that the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee are considering how the Act is working in practice. The same principles of openness and accountability must apply to all public bodies, including our NHS. That is exactly why the Scottish Government established the independent public inquiries into the two cases I've spoken about today. I once more stress that the importance of the independence of this process. Presiding Officer, the Labour motion today cannot be supported by Parliament. It explicitly calls on the Parliament to undermine the public inquiry by immediately releasing information prior to Lord Brodie publishing his final report. That would not just be disrespectful to Lord Brodie, but potentially illegal and an injustice to the patients, the families and the whistleblowers who should be at the centre of all of our thoughts today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Fitzpatrick. I call Stephen Kerr to be followed by Christine Graham. Mr Kerr.
Well, the last few comments from Joe Fitzpatrick are absolute nonsense. To talk about a motion before Scotland's Parliament of being illegal, that somehow we're breaking the law by discussing this issue, which is being discussed across the country, on the news channels, in the newspapers. The idea that Scotland's Parliament somehow has to hud its wished, that we shouldn't talk about these things, is utterly ridiculous. Now, I've watched the SNP in opposition. I'm old enough to remember when they were the opposition here, and I've watched them close up as an opposition at Westminster. Not for 1 minute would Neil Gray allow the government at Westminster, or would his colleagues in the earlier sessions of this Parliament when there was a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition, they would never have allowed them to do the things that this government is being accused of. Yes, I'll give way.
Alistair Allen.
In the interests of accuracy, lest the member has misunderstood what I understood Joe Fitzpatrick to have said. He did not suggest it was illegal for the Parliament to discuss these matters, but that it might be illegal for the Government to follow the advice in the motion.
Stephen Kerr.
He said the motion. He said the motion. That's right. I mean, Emma Harper surpasses herself for what she said. I mean, I have never heard such nonsense. I think Paul Sweeney's right. What kind of self-respecting parliamentarian begins to draw boundaries around what the things are, the things that this Parliament is going to consider? It's just ridiculous. And then to have the convener of the Health and Social Care Committee of this Parliament spend more than half her speech erecting a barrier to stop ministers from being held accountable by this Parliament. We had more of that from Joe Fitzpatrick. This is typical SNP behaviour, because every time the SNP get themselves into scandalous difficulty, they erect this barrier, they put up this defence. Oh, let's not be political, let's be above party politics. That is very far from the culture of the SNP when they're the opposition, and it should be very far from the culture of the opposition, and indeed the very culture of this Parliament, if we are to take ourselves seriously, as Paul Sweeney suggests, as parliamentarians. This is a political matter, because this scandal didn't happen by accident. It happened because a government, frankly, has been in power for far too long, stopped listening, stopped questioning itself, has drank the Kool-Aids, dining out on its own propaganda. This is the legacy that this SNP government leaves. The Queen Elizabeth University Hospital should have been a place of safety. Instead, for far too many families, it became a place of fear, infection, unimaginable loss. Families were told nothing. They were lied to, in fact, worse than nothing. Clinicians, named by the leader of the Labour Party in this debate, who stood up and spoke up, were brave, were vilified. Beyond being ignored, they were vilified, they were marginalised. Warnings were downplayed, reports were ignored. You can't help but conclude that the ministers in this government, from that time and even today, are either grotesquely incompetent or they are not telling the truth. You can take your choice. I would.
I thank Mr Kerr for taking the intervention. Several members on the SNP benches have said that we have to listen to the voice of doctors. 3 doctors I referenced at the start, because of whom we are in the place we are today in terms of making progress. Dr Redding, Dr Peters and Dr Inkster say they are not satisfied with the conditions in the here and now. Why are they being ignored again, like they've been ignored for the last 10 years, when they've been proven to be right and the government has proven to be wrong?
Stephen Kerr.
For the very simple reason, Anna Sarwar is right in raising what he's raised. For the very simple reason that whistleblowing by this government is not respected. And I refer members to my register of interest. They talk a good game about whistleblowers, but they don't listen to them. I've heard the Deputy First Minister denigrate those who have whistleblown about areas within her responsibilities. And Neil Gray always says the right words, but nothing happens. The culture doesn't change. Tayside is a very good example. This is another good example. There are examples all across the public services in Scotland. Wonderful, decent people work in the public services in this country. And they often see things and experience things that causes them to raise concerns. They then are victimised for speaking up. The establishment in those public services closes ranks because it's all about reputational damage limitation. That's the problem at the heart of our public services. An unhealthy attitude towards whistleblowing, an unhealthy attitude towards truth-telling and candour. Now, the fact of the matter is, and the words are significant, pressure was applied. And whatever the Health Board says now, at whoever's behest, to cover up more of the trails that have led us to this point, pressure was applied. That doesn't talk about pressure within the organisation. To apply pressure suggests something external. So let's be absolutely clear. This whole episode is not a freak occurrence. It isn't a freak occurrence. It was not bad luck. It was the foreseeable consequence of decisions taken at the top, and that must extend to Scottish ministers, driven by political priorities, not patient safety. Yes, there was an election. Yes, there was a deadline. Yes, there was going to be a grand opening, similar to the grand launch of the ferries, with painted-on windows and fabricated funnels or whatever it was. Another contract. I wish I could take an intervention, but time doesn't allow. I just believe, fundamentally believe, that at the heart of all of this there lies an arrogance and a corruption, a dishonesty, a culture where there is disregard, in fact disrespect, beyond disrespect,
Mr.
for
Kerr, you
those
will
who
need to
blow
conclude.
the whistle. This government is morally bankrupt. For the sake of Scotland, we must get them out of office.
Thank you, Mr. Kerr. And I now call Christine Graham. Ms Graham.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I begin by sending my heartfelt condolences to families affected, especially those with children, because as a parent and grandparent, I cannot imagine the pain and loss, which I know will have no end. I thank those who fought for a full determination of what happened at the Queen Elizabeth. Now, I've challenged Anna Sarwar on rerunning a live inquiry, an inquiry structured strictly in terms of the Inquiry 2005 Act, UK legislation, and the Inquiry in Scotland Rules 2007. It has taken 5 years, no doubt extended by COVID. Evidence has just concluded with closing statements. In my view, I submit that it has been thorough. The report is to be issued later this year. Now, commentary is unavoidable on the evidence, but on the outcome, that's not helpful. For me, it undermines confidence in the independent inquiry process. So I despair at politicising by anyone this extremely distressful and serious issue. So I repeat, the Cabinet Secretary decides the remit and the terms of reference, consulting with the appointed inquiry chair on those terms of reference before they are finalised and published. That is the end to government involvement in the running of the inquiry. It is the chair who is wholly responsible from then on for conducting the investigation within that agreed remit and those references. So there's a robust legal statutory framework to guarantee, in the interest of everyone, the independence of a public inquiry. This one is chaired by Lord Brodie KC, Inner House judge, operating independently, with authority to call witnesses and review evidence, including government ministers, and to compel attendance. I therefore take issue in particular with the following phrase in the Labour motion, and I quote, "Many serious questions remain regarding the decision-making process and the role of the Scottish Government, considers that political decision-making should be considered by the inquiry." In fact, Anna Sarwar called recently for John Swinney and Nicola Sturgeon to give evidence to the inquiry. Now, that's political interference. Is Anna Sarwar suggesting that Lord Brodie has failed to call witnesses, that his chairmanship is questionable, inadequate, not independent of politics? Lord Brodie called whom he wanted, what documents, exchanges, and he could compel any witness that he wanted to come to that inquiry. So the question in here is, does this Parliament have confidence in Lord Brodie? That's a very, very serious question. Current political commentary on whom to ultimately blame is unavoidable, and I accept that. But returning, I'll take an intervention. Is the member actually saying that Lord Brodie is incompetent to chair this?
Stephen Kerr.
To Christine Graham. Of course we're not suggesting that the judge is incompetent. What we're pointing to is the incompetence of this government. The incompetence of this government to not be able to give straight answers to straight questions. This is another speech from the same briefing. It's whataboutery.
I think Ms Graham's got the gist. Christine Graham.
I think I'm trying to speak with my legal hat on. And if Anna Sarwar is saying that certain witnesses should have been called and have not been called, that, for me, is a challenge to Lord Brodie. How can it not be? Now, I've said...
Could we please,
I
members...
hope I didn't overhear some...
I didn't hear anything. I'm just hearing lots of noise, and I would like to hear the person who's the floor, and that is Christine Graham. Please continue.
I think I heard something highly critical of Lord Brodie. I hope the OR picked it up. Current political commentary on whom to ultimately blame is unavoidable. I accept that. But rerunning issues and I want it to be strict. I want people to be blamed. I want it to be sorted. But I want it to be sorted in inquiry, not in the heat of political debate in this chamber. That legal framework establishes independence. The chair is independent. So I find it disgraceful that in here, and I won't just name Mr Sarwar, but members here, seem to be undermining the entire independence of that process. And you know something? That is a total disservice to grieving people.
Thank you, Ms Graham. We will now move to closing speeches, and I call on Gillian Mackay to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Could I ask members just to listen? I'm the chair, and I find it really discourteous to have all this back chat when I'm speaking, so I don't know how other members feel. Anyway, Gillian Mackay on behalf of the Scottish Greens, who's joining us remotely. Ms Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've heard many times from government that we need to let the Scottish Hospitals Inquiry do its work and respect its outcome, and I absolutely agree with that. Only then can we learn the lesson of what went wrong and how we can make sure this never happens again. However, I do believe that we need to take action now to restore confidence in the hospital and the board. We need to communicate clearly and reassuringly to patients, families and staff that the hospital is safe. We need to let people know that if they do raise concerns, these will be taken seriously. We need to reassure patients and their families that if they seek treatment from NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, that they will be cared for by its incredibly hard-working and compassionate staff. We also need to look to the future and how we ensure this whole sorry episode is not repeated. Thankfully, I'll take the intervention from Anna Sarwar.
Anna Sarwar.
I thank Julie Mackay for taking the intervention. I wholeheartedly welcome the comments that she's made. On that basis, will she accept that to reassure families and patients at the Queen Elizabeth, it is important that the Government clarifies if the hospital and all the wards have been validated and are safe? And will she also agree that the concerns being raised by those 3 doctors should be listened to right now?
Gillian Mackay.
Thank Mr Sarwar for his intervention. I think it's critical that we ensure that people have confidence that if they attend appointments at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, that it is safe. And I think we do need to make sure that whistleblowing is actually safe for people to be able to do. And I'll come back to that later on in my contribution. With new sites planned, such as Monklands in my own region, we need to restore public confidence in the processes and ensure people are reassured that these new hospitals will be fully up to standard. We need to improve the culture across all boards, and as the motion notes, NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde are not the only ones to have been hit by scandal. There are consistent issues around governance and whistleblowing where staff are not taken seriously. We have lots of policies and procedures around whistleblowing, but clearly this doesn't always translate to staff feeling listened to and safe to raise concerns. Many will still be concerned about their jobs and their careers. Clearly, what we're talking about today is a very emotive subject, and this has been an emotional debate. Patients and families have experienced trauma and suffering where they should have felt safe. Tensions are running high, and that's understandable. But what's most important is that we learn from this and ensure it never happens again. Yes, we have to get to the bottom of what went wrong. Yes, there should be political accountability. But we don't serve the interest of the family at the heart of this when we play political point scoring with our stories, and I fear that some will be disappointed in some of what has happened today. The privacy of those who've suffered should also always be respected. Their stories should be told if they want them to be, to show the impact the scandal has had on them, but in a way that respects their trauma and doesn't compound it. We will no doubt continue to debate this matter in Parliament, and I'd urge members to think about their tone and how they speak about what are ultimately very personal and painful experiences. The inquiry has taken a trauma-informed approach, and that's important, and these families have suffered enough, and I look forward to when the inquiry's final report is published and they get the answers they deserve. As others have said, I hope that it will bring some level of peace, although it will never make up for what they've endured. While that work is ongoing, however, the Government and the Board can act now to reassure patients, families and staff, and I hope that in his closing the Cabinet Secretary can confirm that the hospital is safe, and it's vital that that message isn't lost in the revelations about infections and scandals. Anyone who's unwell should feel entirely confident seeking help. No one should be put off treatment because they're worried about the hospital making them ill. It won't make a difference in me saying that, however, and both the Board and the Government have a lot of work to do to restore the trust that's been broken. Staff will also have been traumatised by finding out the building where they work, where they care for patients, wasn't safe. To give their patients the best possible care, they need to know that their environment isn't a risk to them. The staff that raised concerns have been betrayed by the board, and despite the board's admission of guilt, it will take some time to address the hurt and repair that rift. And we must not lose sight of the fact that throughout this episode, clinical staff have tried to do what's best for their patients. They've cared for them to the best of their ability and tried to raise concerns when the building they were working in made that impossible. And I want to pay testament to the doctors, nurses and other clinical staff who've worked so hard for their patients in such trying circumstances. Given the huge public interest in this issue, my amendment seeks to ensure that no family will be able to be identified through the release of materials unless they wish to do so. Some families have chosen to come forward and share their stories, and they should be commended and supported. But those who either haven't wanted to or don't feel able to should be respected too. It also seeks to acknowledge the pain of patients and their families while urging the Scottish Government to restore confidence in services being delivered at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, and I hope that members will be able to support it at decision time.
Thank you, Ms Mackay. I now call on Jackson Carlow to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital is my hospital. I've been treated there. My 94-year-old's mother has been saved, life has been saved several times in that hospital. My constituents have been born in that hospital. Some have been treated. Some have died. But anybody who does die in that hospital should die because of the underlying conditions that led them there, and not because of the failings in the hospital itself. And so I come to this debate today, frankly, with a cold fury. And if Mesh was the scandal of the last Parliament, let me agree entirely with Anas Sarwar when he opened this debate with a devastating and forensic attack on the way this matter has been handled by agreeing that this has been the health scandal of this Parliament. And party politics aside, let me thank him for the unrelenting focus that he has continued to bring on this issue throughout the lifetime of this Parliament. And let me say to Nicola Sturgeon, if you can find the time to write a memoir about your time in government, you should consider it your duty to find the time to contribute and to answer for one of the greatest scandals of that time in government. And let me pick up a point that Paul Sweeney made, because I think culture is absolutely underpinning all of this. Way before this scandal, when I spoke in health between 2007 and 2016, I pointed to the increasing culture of cover-up within the health service by having patients sign non-disclosure agreements and accept compensation without proper accountability ever being tracked, traced, or individuals being held to account for their actions. And it leads to the very scandal that we find ourselves facing now. When I stood here as acting leader of my party, I asked in January 2019, following the deaths then of patients, when Jean Freeman announced that there would be a review of the Queen Elizabeth University's hospital's building, design, commissioning, construction and other related issues and how they contributed towards effective infection control, I asked the First Minister, I said this: last year, Professor Alison Britton published her findings on the way in which all future National Health Service reviews should be conducted and made 46 key recommendations. Will the First Minister confirm that the review into the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital will meet those tests? The First Minister confirmed that it would. Transparency, listening to patients, telling people what went on was at the heart of Professor Alison Britton's recommendations. And what a travesty and a sham to argue that those recommendations have been implemented when we know that the Health Service, the Health Board in Glasgow, lied and lied again to patients for years rather than answering or holding themselves to account for the scandal that they brought. Mr Sweeney.
I thank the member for giving way, making a powerful speech. Does he agree that truth doesn't care about power or ideology? It is perpetual. And if the truth is that the person who applied pressure to put schedule and cost over safety was guilty of a criminal act, does he agree?
Jackson Carlow.
I do. And I want to go further on, because in 2019, at First Minister's questions, I pointed to inconsistencies in Jean Freeman's statement. First of all, on the radio, said she didn't know about a boy's death or the investigation that took place. Then she suddenly decided she did know about the boy's death, but she didn't know about the investigation. And the First Minister was trying to tell us that these were reconcilable contradictions. In my view, the Health Secretary took the appropriate action, and I've heard repeated SNP members this afternoon talk about the sanctity of the public inquiry being held by Lord Brodie. You'd think they'd called for it. They didn't. SNP members opposed the public inquiry and supported Jean Freeman, who, when asked whether there should be a public inquiry, said, "My straightforward answer is the one that I've given before. No, I do not agree. I do not believe a public inquiry would add to our understanding of this issue." So spare me hiding behind the public inquiry now in the face of the evidence that we have before us. Presiding Officer, I don't think there is any issue here before this Parliament that is more horrendous than the one that we've experienced at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. When you look at the contributions of the parents as they react to the evidence that's unfolded, we really should, as a Parliament, be totally ashamed. And I see the First Minister's entered the chamber, and I'm going to conclude by a thought that's rested with me since his contribution at First Minister's questions. In response to Russell Finlay, when asked whether anybody in the government had exerted pressure, he said the short answer was no. The only way he could know that, the only way he could be certain of that, the only way in which he could stand before Parliament and tell us that, is if he had asked the people who said that pressure had been applied who it was that had applied the pressure. Because the First Minister couldn't know, just by standing before us, that no official, no minister, no member of his party had sought to apply pressure. He could only know it if he knows who it was that did apply the pressure. And subsequently we're being told that the pressure was applied by the Health Board on itself. Well, I mean, that just is a ridiculous assertion. The pressure is not something that's applied amorphously. Pressure is applied by an individual. If the First Minister can say it wasn't anybody in his government, he must know who it was. And if he hasn't asked who it was, then he should have asked who it was. And the public and this Parliament should be told. And I think we're absolutely right to focus on this debate today and to support the motion before Parliament.
Thank you, Mr Carlow. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Neil Gray to close on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, thank you. As this debate draws to a close, I want to return to those affected by the matters before the inquiry. Families who lost loved ones, patients who endured harm, and staff who spoke up, despite personal risk, have shown courage that deserves our deepest respect. Their testimony has been brave, often harrowing, and it is because of them that these issues are finally receiving full and independent scrutiny. I have reached out to those patients and families through their legal representatives and offered them all the opportunity to meet with me to share their experiences and concerns. Scottish ministers recognise all those adversely impacted by the matters this inquiry is examining. Recognition of that harm is precisely why the Government established a statutory, independent, judge-led public inquiry to uncover the full truth and ensure lessons are learned. Presiding Officer, it is vital that we reaffirm a principle at the heart of this discussion, the independence of the inquiry. The powers entrusted to Lord Brodie under the Inquiries Act protect this process from any direction or influence by ministers or by Parliament. That independence is not a technicality. It is what allows families to have confidence that every decision, every document and every witness is assessed on the evidence. We've provided the inquiry with all evidence relevant to its terms of reference, and whilst our submissions have been substantial, it must be recognised that they alone do not provide the full picture of events. The totality of that information from all core participants is before Lord Brodie, who must now be given the space to deliberate and establish what happened, why it happened and what must change. As Council and expert witnesses have confirmed, the hospital today operates under strengthened oversight with significant improvements in safety systems and clinical governance. I will give way.
Brian Whittle.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary. Can I ask him directly, has a full safety audit of the hospital been done since this scandal erupted?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, again, these are matters that are before the inquiry, that the evidence has been led and been sought. It would be wrong to come to conclusions. I'm setting out. Bear with me. I'm setting out the situation as to the current safety of the hospital. Delivering safe, effective and person-centred care in a clean and well-maintained environment, let me finish my point, to our patients is of utmost importance to the Scottish Government, and that remains our priority. To the questions from Gillian Mackay, from other colleagues around the confidence of the public that the hospital is safe, I say I can give assurance for two reasons. First, the evidence that was led by the independent witness, Mr Poplett, and secondly, following the assurances that I have sought in that regard from Healthcare Improvement Scotland in March of last year, to conduct a further review of the progress being made by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde in meeting health and safety requirements and recommendations as set out in the action plan from the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital Assurance of Infection Prevention and Control Inspection of June 2022. In addition, there was a focused inspection of the Emergency Department in July of 2024, part of the wider Greater Glasgow and Clyde Emergency Department review that resulted in a number of actions that have also been addressed. The Healthcare Improvement Scotland subsequently confirmed that it was reassured by the response to that review by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, assurance that has continued through a series of further inspections. So let me also be clear that staff who raised concerns, often in extremely difficult circumstances, must be protected and heard. I absolutely agree with that. I have set that out clearly. Strong whistleblowing arrangements are essential to ensuring that when concerns arise, they lead to action. Policy measures are in place to support this, including the NHS Scotland whistleblowing policy, set against the national whistleblowing standards and independent national whistleblowing officer role that is delivered by the Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, an independent advice line and dedicated whistleblowing champions in each health board to seek assurance that staff are encouraged and supported to speak up. Last week, I met with the Scottish Patient Safety Commissioner, and next week I am meeting with the Independent National Whistleblowing Officer to discuss relevant matters and demonstrate my support for these important roles and how they contribute to public service. I want to give Parliament that absolute assurance around my expectation, this Government's expectation, as to the culture that governs our National Health Service. When the final report is published, the Government will consider its findings with the seriousness they demand. We will consider in full those recommendations when published. We have fully complied with the independent public inquiry. We have supplied all information to it, as it should be expected that we do. And of course, if there are further information or evidence that is required and requested by the independent inquiry, of course we will comply with that. Presiding Officer, the families affected by these events deserve that clarity, accountability and lasting change, and that is the commitment that I reaffirm today.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I call Jackie Bailey to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Children have died, adults have died, families are grieving, and can I say to Emma Harper, hard-working staff did come forward. They shared their concerns, they were bullied, they were ignored, and they've been let down. This is the worst scandal in this current term of the Scottish Parliament, and it could so easily have been avoided. And I want to take you back to December 2007, when at least 143 patients contracted Clostridium difficile at the Vale of Leven Hospital. C. diff was found to be a contributory factor in at least 34 of those patients' deaths. And just like those in the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, those patients went into hospital expecting to get better, but they never came out. The families rightly campaigned for a public inquiry, and the inquiry, chaired by Lord Maclean, published its report in September 2014, 6 months before the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital opened. The report made a series of recommendations on everything from governance to the management of infection control. The tragedy which affected so many of my constituents at the Vale of Leven could have been avoided, and that is so true for the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. The Scottish Government said at the time that lessons would be learned, But 6 months later, they opened a new hospital when it was clearly not safe to do so, and the consequences have been devastating. Now, the Scottish Government accepted responsibility for what happened at the Vale of Leven, stating, "We apologise unreservedly for the suffering and loss caused. We accept in full all of the report's recommendations." The statement continued, "We can ensure structures and mechanisms are in place to make sure that what happened at the Vale of Leven Hospital does not happen anywhere else in future." And this is relevant, Presiding Officer, because a month after that comment, I questioned the then Health Minister, Shona Robson, in February 2015 at the Health and Sport Committee. I asked her, in light of the Vale of Leven Hospital inquiry report, whether an independent audit of the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital had been carried out. It was a recommendation that the Government accepted. After some pressing, she said, and I quote, "If it has not taken place, it will. We will check that." In April 2015, just before the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital opened, she wrote to me, claiming that there was no need for an independent audit, no need to follow the Maclean recommendation, because there was robust monitoring and reporting in place. There was even a risk register. I wonder whether the Cabinet Secretary can tell us whether the risk register identified any of the problems with water or ventilation at the time. I suspect not. Had Shona Robson commissioned the independent audit as recommended by the Maclean inquiry that the Government is so keen to learn lessons from, we would not be here debating the issue today, and families would not be grieving the loss of loved ones. So was it criminal negligence or incompetence? You know, there's no getting away from the fact that senior government ministers chose not to have this new hospital inspected with deadly consequences. The Maclean report also recommended robust reporting systems for infection monitoring. At that same committee hearing in 2015, Shona Robson told me, "I get alerted straight away about C. diff cases or any other infection in hospitals in Glasgow, in Clyde or elsewhere because the monitoring systems work." I know this because it was one of the issues arising from the C. diff outbreak at the Vale of Leven. Whenever a healthcare infection incident assessment tool, otherwise known as a HIAT, is read, the Cabinet Secretary is automatically notified. In June 2017, when a HIAT red warning was issued at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, Shona Robson would have been informed. What did she do? Well, in January 2018, such was the complacency that she accused Anna Sawar of talking down the hospital. And this is what she said: "It is outrageous that he's talking down our first-class, state-of-the-art hospital. She had the HIAT report 6 months earlier. She misled this Parliament, and children had already died." Again, I have to ask, was it criminal negligence or was it incompetence? From the moment the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital opened, it was clear to those with knowledge of infection control that the water and ventilation systems were not adequate. Brave doctors risked their careers to raise their concerns, but they were bullied, they were sidelined and they were ignored. The Health Board has now admitted it opened the hospital too early because pressure was applied. Shortly before John Swinney appeared on national TV, the Health Board clarified that this was internal pressure. Really? Really? If you know anything about the relationship between the Health Board and the Scottish Government, the pressure would have been external to the Health Board. It would come from ministers or civil servants on behalf of ministers. So I repeat the question asked by Anas Sawar at the beginning of this debate. Who applied that pressure? We need answers from the Government. In April 2015, when the hospital opened, we were weeks away from a general election. What a coincidence. For months in advance of that, ministers boasted in this chamber that this was a flagship Scottish Government project. Now, it's nothing to do with them, it's the Health Board's fault. Now, I know this because I've been around here for a long time. I know that the SNP government has a fondness for announcements. Every government does. But we've seen it. And Stephen Kerr was right to remind us that it was Nicola Sturgeon who launched a ferry with painted-on windows that is yet to sail. In this case, a hospital was opened too early and people died. So let me say to the Cabinet Secretary, stop the secrecy, release all the documentation that covered political decision-making, and most important of all, the Cabinet Secretary must ensure the safety of the hospital today, because we know that not all of the hospital has been validated as safe. And counsel to the inquiry, Fred McIntosh, urged the Health Board to act now, not wait for the findings of the inquiry. So it would be a gross dereliction of duty on the part of the Cabinet Secretary to risk patient safety. He needs to act on this now. And can I add, and I'm grateful to the First Minister for joining us now, because if the Cabinet Secretary won't act, will the First Minister do so? Because we owe it to the families, to the hard-working staff, to the future patients. So I urge members to support the Labour motion, to support the amendments from the Greens and the Conservatives, but reject the SNP amendment was about doing nothing, continuing the secrecy and covering up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That concludes the debate on the role of political decision-making in NHS scandals. It's now time to move on to the next item of business. I'll allow a moment or two for front benches to arrange themselves.